Hi everybody, I'm Michael. I'm a landscape architect here in Florida. Thank you for stopping by. I'm making this video in an effort to help folks who have just recently gone through a hurricane, like those poor folks who suffered through Hurricane Ian just now, and in ways to help them recover their trees and their garden spaces. I'm also doing this video in ways to try to help folks to future-proof their gardens so they can handle future storm events. So let's dig into it, shall we? To find out what wind-resistant trees and palms you want to use in your garden, you first need to know about right tree, right place. And that's going to be an overlay of where you live in Florida in conjunction with the plant hardiness zones of Florida. The practice of right tree, right place also includes placing your tree in the right location of your home. You don't want to put a large tree under a power line or in an area where it's too close to the home, or an area where it's going to have trouble getting its roots established. If it's crowded out, the roots are not going to get down and into the soil enough to anchor the tree. So you want to make sure that you're also putting the tree in the right location, and we'll go into that a little bit further when we go over the plant list. But before we do that, let's quickly go over the plant hardiness zones of Florida. We have 8 hardiness zones, 8A through 11B, more than any other state. The hardiness zones are divided up by their minimum temperatures. 8A is going to be the coldest and 11B is going to be the warmest. And you can see that in the color coding of the state here. 8A and 8B is going to include areas from Pensacola all the way over to Tallahassee. And trees, palms, and shrubs that do well growing in 9A are going to be in the areas of Cedar Key, Crystal River, Spring Hill, all the way through Ocala, Gainesville, and up to St. Augustine and Jacksonville. Area 9B is primarily the areas around St. Pete, Bradenton, Sarasota, then inland to Sebring, Lake Wells, Kissimmee, Orlando, and then over to Daytona, Edgewater, and Cape Canaveral. You do have some 10A along the extreme coastal edges there along Sarasota, Bradenton, but most of this area is considered 9B. 10A is going to include areas of Sarasota, Venice, Port Charlotte, Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, Naples, then over into Stewart, Fort Pierce, and Vero Beach. 10B includes Miami, most of Fort Lauderdale, and the coastal areas of West Palm. 11A is going to include the areas from Card Sound down to Marathon, and 11B is going to be areas from Marathon all the way down to Key West. Okay, now with this information, you can find out what hardiness zone you live in, and we can go over the trees that grow in your area. The hurricane-resistant tree and palm list here is derived from a study that the University of Florida IFAS prepared after a series of hurricanes came through Florida. They analyzed the damage done to many different trees throughout the state, and they compiled a list. I'll leave you a link to the IFAS report in my description box. The IFAS report is all-encompassing. It even talks about weak-rooted trees. I didn't go into that. I just wanted to prepare a list that shows you high wind-resistant trees and palms and medium-resistant trees and palms. So we're going to focus on that. And one big disclaimer here. There are many factors that determine the health and resiliency of your tree, whether you have a tree that was healthy when you purchased it, whether the tree is growing in the right location and there's enough room for it to grow, whether it's been pruned adequately over time. There's many factors, but overall, this list is showing you the species of trees that tend to do well in high wind and medium wind conditions. High wind resistant trees that grow in 8A through 9A are the dogwood. I love that tree. It's a small tree. The American holly, inkberry, you get scrub, hickory. Really tough one is the live oak. That grows throughout Florida. That's a super resilient tree. And there's a host of others listed here. Now below that are high wind resistant palms that grow in 8A and 9A. Those include the Pindo palm, the Canary Island date palm, super tough palm that's gone through many different types of storms down here in Florida and South Florida. This grows all the way from North Florida all the way down into South Florida. Super tough palm. The dactylifera palms and the sable palm. All these are great palms that do real well in hurricanes. And here you can see the IFAS compiled list of medium wind resistant trees. We have the sugar maple, the Japanese maple. Oh, such a beautiful little tree. river birch, you have some more hickories there, you have some of the sweet bay magnolia, those do okay, and some others. Now moving on to hardiness zones 9B and 11, you can see high wind resistant trees such as the gumbo limbo. I absolutely love this tree. It's a Florida native. There's a massive one growing at Grundles Park down in South Florida. Wonderful, wonderful tree growing on a mound there. Must be 70, 80 years old. Super resilient. It's gone through so many hurricanes. Holds up like a champ. The branches will break, but it tends not to uplift or turn over. So this is a really good tree. The green buttonwood below that, that's a really tough tree as well. It's another Florida native. The Geiger tree, that's a Florida native. It's a small tree. There's also the live oak, which grows all the way through Florida from 8A all the way down to 11B. And that's a super tough tree. It does very, very well. And we also have the bald cypress here. The bald cypress grows all the way through Florida. And over here is a list of high wind resistant palms. You have the Eureka, which is a small palm, the Florida Silver, the Bottle, Spindle, those are all small palms. But the Canary Island Date, that grows down here in South Florida. That's a very tough palm, as I mentioned earlier. You also have the Alexander, the Pygmy Date, that's super tough. The Robolini, that's a super, super tough small palm. The Sable Palm, which grows throughout Florida. And also the Key Thatch and Florida Thatch. I love the Florida Thatch. It's such a cool small palm. Below that are medium wind resistant trees, such as the Pond Apple, the beautiful Brazilian Beauty Leaf, the beautiful Satin Leaf, it's a small tree, the Sea Grape, super tough, but gets very, very broad and very, very big, and Pigeon Plum, as well as the native Lysoloma, the wild tamarind. Those, to me, tend to be higher wind resistant, but IFAS has found them to be medium wind resistant. I would think probably only the Pigeon Plum would be medium wind resistant. I found all the others to be pretty high wind resistant, but I defer back to IFAS on this. They've considered these medium wind resistant trees. There are two trees that IFAS didn't include in the medium wind resistance that I think should be, but again, I'm going to refer back to IFAS on this list. But the trees to consider that I've seen that have held up pretty well over many, many different hurricanes is the Royal Poinciana, if you plant her right, as well as the native ficus trees. So I think those should be considered if you plant the right tree in the right place. You've got to give these trees lots of room to grow, and they do pretty well. Some more medium wind resistant trees here are the mastic, the paradise tree. That Florida native tends to break up in a storm a little bit. So it's about right to classify that as a medium wind resistant tree. Doesn't tend to overturn so much, I've found, but it does tend to break up a little bit. The mahogany you got to be careful with, because sometimes they tend to grow upright like in a bouquet, and if you don't prune the central leader well, you can get some of these cross branching or these crotches that are very, very tight, and they can cleave in a storm. There was a beautiful one across from our Miami Shores home, and Wilma just cut the tree in half. It was such a shame. And the lychee tree, it's a fruit tree that gets very large, but it's a pretty tough wind resistant tree, a medium wind resistant tree. And below that, we have medium wind resistant palms, such as the fishtail, coconut, triangle, and royal. I happen to disagree with IFAS here, but again, I'm deferring to them on this because they've done the study. I found that coconut and royal palm does very well. I think they're high wind resistant palms. The buds may get messed up, and we'll go into that in a little bit in this discussion here, but those are pretty tough palms. And now with that, let's move on to post-storm plant care and pre-storm plant care tips. Okay, in this segment, let's first start with post-storm tree trimming. For your trees that haven't toppled over, but have been kind of broken up by all the high winds, you've got to be very careful to look up and see if you see any widowmakers. Widowmakers are these branches that have this Y shape or this wishbone shape, and they kind of get caught up in the other branches of the tree. And some of these branches can be very large and very dangerous, because if you trim these branches, and some people trim the lower branches first because they're closer to the ground, this whole Y-shaped piece will turn and it will invert itself and come down like a spear, and they can kill you. So you have to be very careful. Number one rule my mom always said is nobody gets hurt. So after a storm, you've got to make sure you if you have a hard hat, wear one. If you have a lot of branches like this, or hire a professional. But if you have smaller trees and you want to clean up, you got to be very careful to look up around you and see if there's other taller trees that have these widowmakers. This is super important. I cannot stress it enough. Another thing I want to stress while you're out and about is to make sure you wear really tough boots if you can, because there's going to be a lot of debris in the ground, and sometimes there's roofing shingles and other stuff that have nails in it. So you got to be careful where you're walking, and you've also got to be very careful of any power lines that are down. These sometimes get caught up in the trees, so you got to make sure you always assess the area before you do any trimming. Now, as to the actual trimming, you want to make sure you do it properly. There's 3 steps to trimming a branch on a tree. The first cut you want to do is on the bottom part of the branch, a few inches away from the trunk. That's just going to be a nick, could be about a ½ inch or so into the tree. You just want to do this so that when the branch is cut, it doesn't strip the bark. The second cut you're going to do is going to be above and a little bit to the right of the first cut on the top half, and that's going to remove the damaged branch. And the third and final cut is just above the branch collar of the tree. You want to make sure you don't cut it at the collar, but just a few inches off of that so that the tree can heal over that branch that's been cut. Now let's talk about pruning palms and finding ways to save your palms after a storm event. Most likely you're going to notice an image like this after a storm. You're going to see a lot of branches pushed off to one side, and you'll start to see a lot of browning that occurs. If you notice browning at the bud, which is the center part of the palm, that's a problem. The palm is most likely going to die. You probably want to wait a little bit, maybe wait a month or so to see if any bud comes through, because a palm is a monocot and it grows from these central buds, and the bud is a spear-like piece that comes out of the palm. But if you notice it's brown or yellow and it's just sort of flopping over, most likely your palm's bud was too damaged in the storm and it's going to die. Now the inverse to that is a palm that has lots of branches leaning over, but a green bud, and that's a good sign. As you can see in these 3 arrows pointing to these palms here, these royals, those are most likely going to survive. And all you'll need to do to clean up the palm is just to remove any of the other broken branches on the periphery of the palm. But be very careful, some palms can grow very tall, and you want to make sure you safely cut the fronds and don't hurt yourself. Now let's talk a little bit about cleaning up your garden. Here you can see our home in Miami Shores after Wilma came through. We had several trees and palms come down, and we had a whole bunch of plants and shrubs pushed up against the home. We got most of our winds from the south to the north. We did cluster a bunch of potted plants on our patio because our garage was filled with all the other potted plants and we didn't have any room, but the storm just beat them up. One thing lessons learned on this is I probably should have put those potted plants down in the grassy area because it broke apart on our patio and it created a total muddy mess and it blocked up some of our deck drains. So that's a little lessons learned I found on potted plants. If you can't put them inside your garage, try to put them in the grass area and tuck them around close to the home. On the side yard here, there's an image that we just had a whole bunch of palm fronds come down. And the thing I want to note for you here is that underneath those palm fronds, be careful when you're walking through there because you probably have a lot of shrubs that are still okay. The branches are just down on them, but if you trample them, but if you step all over them to get to the palm fronds, you can crush a lot of your shrubs and they're going to suffer. And over here in this video, this is in Key West right after Ian. You can see that the storm winds snapped and broke a lot of the branches of this silver buttonwood hedge. So these are most likely not going to survive and you're going to need to take them out and replant. But over here, you can see this cocoa plum hedge and it's very brown. That's most likely from wind and salt spray coming in off the bay. But this is not severe enough that it's going to kill this plant. This is a very tough Florida native. You may also notice a tree that's all brown like this one here. This is a green buttonwood on the corner of this building. We're near the southernmost part of Key West, near that monument, and this is on the corner right next to a parking lot and the bay. So all the water and that storm surge that came in, and Key West did get some storm surge, and the wind probably whipped this tree on the corner because there's a parking lot across the way there. So that wind was just whipping through there and the wind just tore up these leaves. This tree is super drought tolerant, super salt tolerant, so this will most likely bounce back. So like I said with these other trees and palms, give it about a month and see if you see new growth coming out. Sometimes when a tree looks dead, it's not really dead, it's just that the leaves were put through so much stress and shock that they browned out, but then they'll shoot out new growth from beneath. over time. The last post-storm issue I want to talk to you about is inland flooding. There's not much can be done in this regard, unfortunately. If water stays for days or weeks over tree roots or shrub roots or ground covers, they're most likely going to die. Roots need an oxygen exchange to survive. The one caveat there is probably the bald cypress. Those can handle these type of situations. But if you have a long duration flood, you're going to have some issues where a lot of the stuff dies. The one test to do again is to wait a month or maybe even longer to see if some of your trees bounce back after the water subside. But it's a real shame because flooding is very, very, very hard to come back from. Now let's talk about pre-storm garden planning. You want to trim any of your trees and palms well in advance of a hurricane warning or a hurricane watch, because you don't want to put those branches out for bulk pickup, and if they don't pick up those branches, those things can become projectiles and create a big mess. So what you want to do right before, like in mid-spring, is to do a check of your yard and prune any palm fronds that are an issue, or tree branches, especially cross branching. You want to make sure you trim those out so your trees are healthy and can better handle a storm event. On shrubs, ground covers, and accent plants that you put in potted containers, you want to take those guys in and put them in the garage, or like I said earlier, is tuck them away in some of the shrub beds near your home so that they don't tip over or break like I had on my pool deck. You can take blue painter's tape and tape them together so they don't get picked up in a very high wind. That's a strategy you could also look at as well. But you also want to take out anything that could become a projectile, like tiki torches, barbecue grill. You also want to take in any of your patio furniture if you can, or if you can't bring them in because they're too large, you want to definitely find a way to tie them together and tuck them in next to a shrub bed. And one last thing I want to note is that if you have a specimen tree or a palm that you really care for, you could consider staking them. You could get some stakes and put 4 different stakes into the ground. There's a detail here I'll show you. And the staking may help keep your tree from toppling over. It's not always possible right before a storm, but it's something to consider if you have enough time. We hope this information was helpful. If you have any thoughts or questions, just leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. And until the next video, bye. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And tell your friends and family. We post videos weekly. Thanks.